Your brother is in the ICU. You need to come now. The call ended before I could ask any questions. My hand shook as I held the phone while running through the hospital corridors in Denver, my breath forming small clouds in the cold December air. I found my younger brother Michael, hooked up to more tubes and machines than I could count. His skin was pale as paper, his sunken eyes revealing weeks of sleepless nights. At 26, he looked like he had aged a decade. Heart attack induced by extreme stress, the doctor explained, adjusting her glasses. Sky-high blood pressure, perforated ulcer, clear signs of severe burnout. Your brother was literally killing himself with work. My name is Jacob, I'm 32, and I've never felt so angry in my life. Michael has always been the gentle one between us, preferring to resolve conflicts with diplomacy while I was more direct. Seeing someone so good being torn apart like that ignited something primitive inside me. "Dr. Peters," Michael whispered when he woke up, his eyes filling with panic. "He'll be furious if I don't come back tomorrow. I've already wasted too much time. He said he'll fire me if I miss another day." Dr. Peters. Not even a name, just a title used as a weapon to intimidate. Anger burned in my throat as Michael tried to rip the electrodes from his chest, desperate to get back to work even though he was nearly dead. "Mike, you nearly died," I tried to calm him, holding his trembling hands. "No job is worth your life." "You don't understand," he cried, tears streaming down his face and dripping onto the oxygen tubes. "He controls everything. The mandatory overtime, the impossible deadlines, the yelling in front of everyone. Yesterday he made me work 18 hours straight organizing files that he himself had deliberately disorganized. He said that if I complained, he would make sure I never got a job in accounting in Colorado again." At that moment, watching my broken brother in a hospital bed, I made a decision that would change everything. Peters had made a fatal mistake. He didn't know Michael had an identical twin brother. A brother who had spent 12 years in the military, specializing in psychological operations and interrogation. And Peters was about to meet a version of Michael he never imagined existed. If you're enjoying seeing how arrogance can be costly, don't forget to subscribe to the channel because this story is just beginning. What Dr. Peters didn't know was that I had studied men just like him during my military career. And when a predator encounters someone who knows all his techniques, the hunt is completely reversed. Over the next 2 hours, Michael told me everything. Between panic attacks and doses of morphine, the true face of Dr. Richard Peters was revealed as a monster carefully disguised as a respectable executive. Peters wasn't just a demanding boss. He was a calculating sadist who had turned the Denver branch of Morrison and Associates into a psychological torture chamber. At 52, he ruled the accounting firm with an iron fist, using techniques of humiliation that would make a drill sergeant blush with shame. "He makes me work on weekends organizing files that he messes up on Monday," Michael whispered, his hands trembling as he held the glass of water. "Last week, he made me redo a 400-page spreadsheet because he said he didn't like the font I used. It was the same font the company has been using for 10 years. The pattern was meticulous and cruel. Peters would pick one employee at a time to be his target, usually someone young and dedicated like Michael. First came the public criticism disguised as constructive feedback. Then came impossible workloads with unrealistic deadlines. Finally, complete humiliation in front of colleagues. "Yesterday he called me into the conference room full of important clients," Michael continued, his voice breaking. "He said I was incompetent and should be grateful to have a job, considering my limited intellectual capacity." Everyone laughed. The clients laughed, Jacob. They laughed in my face. My jaw clenched involuntarily. During 12 years in the military, I had faced insurgents, interrogated terrorists, and dismantled criminal cells. But no enemy had provoked the visceral rage I felt toward this man I had never met. Peters had chosen Michael because he was kind, polite, and desperate to impress. My brother worked 70 hours a week, skipped meals, and canceled social plans, all to please a man who saw kindness as a weakness to be exploited. "He has a system," Michael explained through tears. "He always chooses someone new every 6 months. Before me, it was Jennifer. She had a nervous breakdown and was fired for emotional instability. Before her, it was Marcus. He developed an ulcer and quit. Peters calls it corporate natural selection." The nurse came in to check Michael's vitals, and I took the opportunity to process the information. Peters wasn't just a bully, He was a systematic predator who had perfected his techniques over the years. He knew exactly how to psychologically break a person without leaving any legal evidence. But Peters had made a fatal mistake in choosing Michael as his target. He didn't know that my brother had family who would not accept such treatment. Family with very specific skills for dealing with predators. "Jacob," Michael grabbed my arm as the nurse left. "You can't do anything. He has connections throughout the Colorado accounting industry. If you cause trouble, he'll destroy my career permanently. I've seen him do it to other people." I smiled for the first time since I had arrived at the hospital. A smile that Michael didn't recognize, but that my former unit colleagues knew well. It was the smile I wore when I finally identified the enemy's weak spot. "Mike, you need to trust me. Tomorrow you're going to call Peters and tell him you're coming back to work." I held his hand firmly. "You're going to say the doctor has cleared you for light duty and you don't want to let the team down." "Jacob, no," he protested. "You're not going back," I continued, my voice taking on the calm tone I used during military briefings. "I am." Michael looked at me confused for a few seconds before understanding hit his face like lightning. We were identical twins, same height, same weight, same hair color. The only difference was that I had muscles developed by the army, while Michael had lost weight due to stress. But a few days at the gym and some loose-fitting clothes would take care of that. "Dr. Peters is about to meet a version of Michael he never imagined existed," I said, adjusting the pillow behind my brother's head. "A version who has spent 12 years learning exactly how to deal with men like him." The irony was delicious. Peters had broken my brother by considering him weak and submissive. Now he was going to find out what happens when someone with that same appearance possessed all the psychological tools necessary to destroy a predator. And the best part? He would never suspect he was being hunted until he was completely cornered. The next 3 days were a complete immersion in the hell Peters had created for my brother. While Michael recovered in the hospital, I studied every detail of his work routine, every mannerism, every vulnerability that Peters systematically exploited. Lisa, the receptionist at Morrison & Associates, sent me discreet photos of the work environment via Michael's phone. The company occupied 2 floors of a commercial building in downtown Denver, with Peters controlling everything from his corner office, surrounded by glass walls that allowed him to observe his employees' every move. He installed cameras at every workstation, Michael told me during one of my visits. He says it's for productivity optimization, but he actually uses the recordings to humiliate people in meetings. Last week he projected a video of me yawning during lunch and said I was lazy. Through conversations with other employees via Michael, I discovered that Peters had created an environment of psychological terror so systematic that it was impressive in its calculated cruelty. He rotated between different targets, keeping everyone in constant anxiety about who would be next. Jennifer Santos, the woman who had suffered a nervous breakdown, still worked at the company in a reduced capacity. Peters kept her there as a living example of what happened to those who couldn't keep up. She did only basic administrative tasks, while Peters occasionally made comments about her instability in front of new employees. "He broke her completely," Michael whispered, connected to the heart monitors. Jennifer was brilliant. A Harvard graduate, she spoke 4 languages. Now she can barely speak in meetings without her hands shaking. Peters stole her soul, Jacob. Marcus Rodriguez, the man who had developed an ulcer before Michael, called me after he heard about the hospitalization. His voice carried a cold anger as he described Peters' methods. "He doesn't yell or swear," Marcus explained. "He's more subtle and more devastating. He praises you in front of others and then calls you in privately to destroy your self-esteem. He says things like, 'Everyone thinks you're competent, but we both know the truth, don't we?' He makes you question your own sanity." The system was diabolical. Peters chose dedicated, insecure people, isolated them psychologically from their colleagues through false favoritism, then used personal information gleaned from casual conversation as weapons. Michael had casually mentioned that our parents died in an accident when we were young. Peters turned that into, "I understand why you have abandonment issues, Michael. Maybe that's why you're so desperate to please." On Tuesday, 3 days after hospitalization, I made my first reconnaissance foray. I put on one of Michael's suits, practiced his slightly stooped posture in the mirror, and walked to the Morrison & Associates building during lunchtime. The lobby was full of employees coming and going. No one recognized me. After all, I was Michael to them. but I was able to observe the atmosphere. People walked quickly, avoiding eye contact, speaking in whispers. It was like a prisoner of war camp disguised as a corporate office. Through the glass wall on the second floor, I saw Peters for the first time. 52 years old, gray hair slicked back, impeccable Italian suit. He was yelling at someone on the phone, gesturing wildly, his face red with rage. Even from a distance, I could feel the toxic energy emanating from him. It was at that moment, watching the man who had systematically destroyed my brother's mental health, that I made my final decision. It wouldn't be enough to simply expose him or sue him. Peters had spent years perfecting the art of breaking people psychologically without leaving any legal evidence. He deserved a taste of his own medicine. During my military career, I specialized in psychological operations and counterterrorism. I learned that the most dangerous predators are those who operate within legal structures, using legitimate authority for illegitimate purposes. Peters was exactly that kind of enemy. By Wednesday, Michael was stable enough to be discharged from the hospital, but the doctors recommended at least 2 weeks of complete rest. Perfect. I had 2 weeks to be Michael and show Peters what happens when he picks the wrong target. "Jacob, are you sure about this?" Michael asked me when I explained the whole plan. If he finds out, he could destroy both our careers. I smiled, adjusting Michael's tie in the hospital mirror. "Mike, he won't find out because he'll be too busy trying to figure out why Michael suddenly stopped being afraid of him." The irony was perfect. Peters had chosen Michael as his target because he saw him as weak and submissive. Now he was going to find out what happens when someone who looks that way has 12 years of military training in psychological warfare. On Thursday morning, I called Peters using Michael's phone. My voice was slightly hoarse, a natural side effect of hospitalization. "Dr. Peters, it's Michael. I know you told me not to call, but the doctor has cleared me for light activity. I don't want to disappoint the team any more than I already have." There was a long pause. I could almost hear Peters savoring the submission in my voice. "Michael," he said finally, his tone laden with feigned concern, "I hope you learned something during your absence. I can't have unstable employees affecting team morale." "I learned a lot, sir. Especially about priorities." I kept my voice humble, but allowed an almost imperceptible hint of something different. "I'll be there on Monday, ready to be the employee you deserve." Peters laughed, a cruel, satisfied sound. "We'll see, Michael. We'll see." I hung up the phone and looked at my reflection in the hospital room window. Peters was about to learn that underestimating someone can be a fatal mistake, especially when that person has brothers who won't tolerate bullying. The hunt had officially begun. And this time, the predator would be the prey. The weekend before my infiltration of Morrison and Associates was devoted to the most meticulous military preparation I had ever undertaken. During 12 years in the Army, I had learned that successful psychological operations depend on 3 fundamental elements: knowing the target completely, mastering the disguise perfectly, and having multiple contingency plans. I began by studying every detail of Michael's routine. Lisa, the receptionist, discreetly sent me photos of the office and a schedule of meetings. I discovered that Peters had a habit of always arriving at 7 in the morning, 2 hours before the other employees, and using that time to review security cameras and plan his daily humiliations. "He takes notes on every employee," Michael told me from the hospital, his voice still weak but more determined. "He observes who arrives late, who goes to the bathroom frequently, who talks during work. He uses everything as ammunition later." Perfect. Peters had created a surveillance system that I could use against him. During my military career, I specialized in psychological operations against insurgents operating within civilian structures. Peters was exactly the same kind of predator, someone who used legitimate authority for personal domination. The difference is that insurgents usually know they're at war. Peters had no idea what he was about to face. I spent the entire Saturday in Michael's room, practicing his slightly hunched posture, his nervous way of adjusting his glasses, the way he spoke more softly when he was anxious. I recorded videos of myself until I achieved a perfect imitation. The physical part was more challenging. Michael had lost 20 pounds due to stress, so I had to wear looser clothes and modify my posture to appear less muscular. But the psychological preparation was even more crucial. During my years in the military, I learned that predators like Peters rely on predictable reactions from their victims. They expect fear, submission, and desperate attempts to please. When those reactions stop appearing, the predator becomes confused and makes mistakes. Jacob, Michael warned me during a call on Sunday, he's going to test you right away. In the first hour, he always does something to humiliate anyone who comes back from medical leave. Last week, he made Robert clean the bathroom because he said physical activity helps with mental health recovery. I smiled when I heard that. Peters was about to discover that humiliating someone with military training in interrogation resistance is like trying to break granite with a teaspoon. My strategy was threefold. First, to establish that Michael had changed subtly during his hospitalization, but in a way that Peters would attribute to medication or trauma. Second, to use psychological mirroring techniques to make Peters feel uncomfortable without understanding why. Third, meticulously document every abusive action he took for later use. Early Monday morning at 5 o'clock, I parked Michael's car in front of the Morrison & Associates building and watched Peters arrive punctually at 7. He drove a black BMW, always parked in the same spot, and walked with the arrogance of someone who believes himself untouchable. At 7:45 a.m., I entered the building wearing Michael's gray suit, carrying his familiar briefcase, and practicing his expression of controlled anxiety. The security guard, Roberto, greeted me as usual. "Good to see you back, Michael. How are you feeling?" "Better, Roberto. Thanks for asking." I kept my voice slightly hesitant, as Michael would. The elevator rose to the second floor in silence. When the doors opened, I could feel the toxic atmosphere Peters had cultivated. Employees walked quickly, avoiding eye contact, whispering to each other. It was an atmosphere of fear as palpable as the battlefields I had known in Afghanistan. Lisa looked at me with genuine concern as I passed the reception desk. "Michael, are you sure you're okay? You still look pale." "I'm fine, Lisa. Just eager to get back to work." I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. My workstation was in the middle of the floor, with a direct view of Peter's office through the glass walls. He was already there, watching the employees' every move like a predator choosing its next prey. At 9 o'clock sharp, as Michael had predicted, the phone on my desk rang. "Michael, come to my office immediately." Peter's voice carried that artificial authority that insecure men use to mask their own weakness. Years of interrogating prisoners of war had taught me to identify this type of personality in seconds. I walked to his office with Michael's slightly stooped posture, but my mind was completely alert, cataloging every detail of the environment. Peters's office was a sanctuary for the ego: framed college diplomas, photos of him shaking hands with local politicians, a bookshelf filled with books on leadership that he clearly had never read. "Sit down," he ordered without looking up from his papers. A classic technique of domination, making the person wait while you demonstrate your importance by pretending to be busy. I sat down in the uncomfortable chair across from his desk and waited. During military interrogations, I learned that silence is a powerful weapon. Whoever feels compelled to fill it first usually reveals more than they intend. After 2 minutes of unnecessary theater, Peters finally looked at me. His eyes were small and calculating, the kind I often found in men who compensated for personal insecurity through cruelty to subordinates. "Michael," he began, his voice laden with feigned concern, "I hope your absence has taught you something about professional commitment." I nodded slightly, maintaining the neutral expression Michael would use. "I learned a lot, Dr. Peters." He leaned forward, clearly expecting signs of nervousness or exaggerated submission. "And what exactly did you learn?" This was the first critical move. Peters expected Michael to beg for forgiveness, promise to work longer hours, accept any humiliation to keep his job. Instead, I maintained direct eye contact, something Michael would never do, and responded calmly. "I learned about priorities, and about recognizing patterns of behavior." The answer was deliberately ambiguous, but loaded with undertones that a paranoid man like Peters would surely pick up on. I saw a slight twitch in his eyes, the first sign that something was not going according to the expected script. If you're following this journey of transformation and want to see how real stories of justice can inspire change, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The most intense part of this psychological strategy is just beginning. Behavior patterns? Peters repeated, his voice taking on a slightly sharper tone. "What exactly are you talking about?" "Nothing specific, sir. Just general observations about work dynamics." I allowed a slight smile to touch my lips, not Michael's submissive smile, but something more subtle and controlled. Peters leaned back in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. During 12 years of dealing with professional manipulators, I learned that they depend on predictable reactions. When those reactions don't appear, the manipulator becomes disoriented. Well, he said finally, I hope these observations don't interfere with your productivity. I have a stack of files that needs to be reorganized by the end of the day. He pointed to a deliberately disorganized pile of documents on the side table. It was exactly the kind of punitive task Michael had described, unnecessary work designed to humiliate and frustrate. Of course, Dr. Peters. I stood up and picked up the stack of files. I'll get started right away. As I walked back to my desk, I could feel Peters watching me through the glass walls. He was trying to figure out why Michael seemed different, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what had changed. For the next 6 hours, I meticulously organized the files while implementing the initial phase of my plan. Every time Peters looked my way, I was working diligently, but there was something about my posture, a subtle confidence that Michael had never displayed. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I took the perfectly organized files back to Peters' office. He examined the work with obvious disappointment at finding no errors to criticize. Adequate, he muttered, clearly frustrated that he had no reason to complain. Thank you, Dr. Peters. Is there anything else that needs to be done? The question was seemingly innocent, but I delivered it with the exact tone of someone who was genuinely willing to work, not desperate to please. The difference is subtle, but predators like Peters detect it instinctively. No. Go home. I gathered my things and headed for the elevator, aware that Peters was still watching me. In the reflection of the elevator doors, I saw him pick up his phone, probably to call someone in HR and ask about my mental state or medications. Perfect. The confusion had begun. That night, I called Michael from the hospital parking lot. How did it go? He asked anxiously. Successful first day. Peters is confused, but he doesn't know why yet. I looked to the brightly lit Morrison and Associates building through the windshield. Tomorrow we start phase 2. Jacob, are you sure this will work? I smiled in the darkness of the car, remembering similar operations in the Middle East where we turned confident predators into desperate men using only psychological techniques. Mike, over 12 years I've learned that every predator has a breaking point. Peters has spent years breaking people because no one has ever turned the tables on him. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. He's about to find out what happens when someone who knows all his techniques decides to use them against him. As I drove home, I was already planning my next moves. Peters had spent years developing his system of psychological domination, perfecting it against defenseless victims like Michael. Now he was going to find out how that same system worked when directed against its creator. The operation had officially begun. And Peters had no idea he was already being hunted. The second week as Michael was when I launched phase 2 of the operation. Peters had spent 7 days trying to figure out why his favorite target seemed different, but he still couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed. It was time to turn up the pressure. On Monday morning, I arrived 15 minutes earlier than usual, something Michael would never do. When Peters arrived punctually at 7 o'clock, he found me meticulously organizing the reception files, a task no one had requested. Michael, he said, stopping abruptly when he saw me. Why are you here so early? Good morning, Dr. Peters. I kept my voice neutral, but completely eliminated the submissiveness Michael always displayed. I was analyzing the efficiency patterns of the old files. I found some interesting discrepancies. The word discrepancies was carefully chosen. In my military experience, I have found that men like Peters are paranoid about exposure. They always assume that discrepancies means evidence of their irregularities. Discrepancies. His voice rose slightly. What kind of discrepancies? Just inconsistencies in the filing processes, sir. Nothing that can't be corrected with the proper procedures. I smiled slightly, not Michael's anxious smile, but something more knowing. Over the next 3 hours, I implemented a military technique called reverse mirroring. Every time Peters tried to humiliate me, I responded with professional calm that made it seem like he was being unreasonable. Michael, this spreadsheet is a mess, he said loudly enough for others to hear, pointing to an error he himself had entered. You're right, Dr. Peters. I'll correct that immediately. I picked up the spreadsheet and instead of looking nervous, examined the error with the expression of someone studying an interesting pattern. It's curious how these types of modifications always appear in the same fields, almost as if there were a systematic pattern. His pupils dilated slightly, a classic sign of increased anxiety. Peters was beginning to realize that his traditional psychological weapons no longer worked, but he still didn't understand why. On Wednesday, I escalated to Phase 3. During a meeting with important clients, Peters attempted his favorite form of public humiliation, calling on me to present a report that he knew was incomplete. "Michael, why don't you explain the status of the Richardson Project to our clients?" It was a classic trap. The Richardson Project was deliberately behind schedule because Peters had given Michael conflicting instructions, creating confusion to justify further humiliation. But I had spent the previous night studying not only the Richardson Project, but all related Morrison and Associates projects from the past 2 years. I stood up with a confidence Michael had never shown. "Of course, Dr. Peters. The Richardson Project is experiencing delays due to scope changes implemented last week." I walked over to the whiteboard and began drawing a detailed timeline. "However, I have identified 3 optimization opportunities that could not only make up for lost time, but deliver the project 2 weeks ahead of the original deadline." Over the next 15 minutes, I presented such a detailed and professional analysis that the clients were genuinely impressed. I used military terminology adapted for business, presentation techniques I learned during operations briefings, and a confidence that came from 12 years of commanding life-and-death situations. "Excellent analysis, Michael," said the lead client when I finished. "That's exactly the strategic approach we were looking for." Peter's face was red when the meeting ended. For the first time in years, his attempt at humiliation had turned into public triumph for the target. Even worse, in front of important clients who now saw Michael as competent and strategic. "My office. Now," he hissed as the clients left. I followed him calmly, noticing how other employees watched us with expressions of shock. They had never seen Michael shine in a presentation, let alone outshine Peters in public. Peters slammed the office door with unnecessary force, another classic sign of losing control. During interrogations, I learned that predators become more dangerous when they feel cornered, but they also make more mistakes. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he exploded, his mask of professionalism finally slipping. "Since when do you take initiative without my approval?" "I'm sorry, Dr. Peters. I thought I was helping the company." I kept my voice perfectly calm, creating maximum contrast with his agitation. "I must have misinterpreted your instructions about proactivity." "Proactivity?" He gave a bitter laugh. "Michael, you can barely organize a drawer without supervision. And now you want me to believe that you've suddenly become a business strategist." This was the opening I had been waiting for. Peters had just crossed a crucial line, publicly questioning the basic competence of an employee. In a company like Morrison and Associates, suddenly become a business strategist. This was the opening I had been waiting for. Peters had just crossed a crucial line, publicly questioning an employee's basic competence. At a company like Morrison and Associates, this constituted documentable harassment. "Dr. Peters," I said, taking my phone out of my pocket, "may I ask if you are recording this conversation for professional development purposes? Because I have been recording all of our interactions since I returned, following the company's new documentation guidelines." I lied about the guidelines, but Peters' reaction was exactly what I expected. His face drained of color when he realized there might be documented evidence of his abusive methods. You're recording me?" "Just following transparency protocols, sir. HR recommended complete documentation of all supervisory interactions after my medical return." Another careful lie. "I can delete it if it makes you uncomfortable." Peters was silent for several long seconds, clearly calculating whether he had said anything incriminating. During that time, I implemented the final phase of the operation. "Dr. Peters," I said, my voice taking on a slightly different tone, no longer submissive, but not confrontational either. It was the tone I used when interrogating prisoners who were about to break. "May I make a personal observation?" He nodded stiffly, still processing the revelation about the recordings. During my hospitalization, I had a lot of time for reflection. About behavior patterns, power dynamics, and how certain personalities operate. I paused, allowing him to absorb each word. It's fascinating how some individuals develop systematic strategies to dominate others psychologically. Peters looked at me as if he were seeing a ghost. For the first time, Michael was speaking with knowledge and authority about psychological manipulation. Especially in corporate environments, I continued, where hierarchy provides legal cover for behaviors that would be considered abusive in other contexts. Michael, he whispered, what exactly are you talking about? I smiled, not Michael's nervous smile, but something colder and more calculated. I'm talking about recognizing patterns, Dr. Peters. And about what happens when someone who understands those patterns decides to no longer be a victim of them. It was at that moment that I saw understanding strike his eyes like lightning. Not complete understanding, he still didn't know who I really was, but the terrifying realization that Michael had become something he couldn't control. Who are you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I stood up slowly, adjusting Michael's tie in the window reflection. I am the person your behavior created, Dr. Peters. The version of Michael that emerges when someone finally stops accepting being broken. I walked toward the door, pausing with my hand on the doorknob. And tomorrow, we're going to have a very interesting conversation about the future of this company. I left him alone in his office, knowing he would spend the entire night trying to understand what had happened. Peters had faced insubordination before, but never such a complete and threatening psychological transformation. As I walked back to my desk, I could feel other employees watching me with a mixture of admiration and fear. For the first time in years, someone had stood up to Peters and won. But the real revelation was yet to come. The next morning, I arrived at the office an hour earlier than usual, but not to work. It was time for the final revelation. Peters had spent the night awake. That much was obvious from his red eyes and stubble when he arrived at 7 o'clock. 12 years of interrogating enemies had taught me to recognize when someone was on the verge of psychological collapse. At 9 o'clock sharp, I knocked on his office door. This time, I didn't wait for permission to enter. Dr. Peters, we need to talk. He looked up from his papers with an expression of barely concealed panic. Michael, about yesterday. I'm not Michael, I said calmly, closing the door behind me and walking to his desk with a straight posture I had never shown before. My name is Jacob Harris, Michael's identical twin brother. And for the past 10 days, I've been watching you through his eyes. The color drained completely from Peter's face. His mouth opened and closed several times without making a sound, like a fish out of water. For years, he had dominated people through psychological shock. Now he was experiencing the same treatment. That's impossible, he stammered. Michael has no brother. Michael never mentioned it because you never cared to get to know him as a person. To you, he was just a convenient target. I sat down in the chair across from his desk with the same military confidence I had developed while commanding troops. But Michael has family. Family who won't stand by and watch predators like you destroy good people. Peters tried to regain his composure, but his hands were visibly shaking as he reached for the phone. I'm calling security. This is trespassing, It's documentation, I interrupted, placing my phone on the desk between us. For the past 10 days, I've recorded every interaction we've had. Every abusive order, every humiliating comment, every attempt at psychological manipulation. I have hours of evidence of systematic workplace harassment. I stood up and began to walk slowly around his desk, a technique I used during interrogations to establish psychological dominance. Peter swiveled in his chair to follow me, his eyes tracking my every movement like a cornered animal. But that's not all, Dr. Peters. You see, during my military career, I developed certain investigative skills. So while you thought you were torturing Michael, I was investigating you. I paused behind his chair. And I discovered some fascinating things. I placed a thick folder on his desk. Peters looked at it as if it were a bomb about to explode. Open it, I ordered in the voice I used to command soldiers. With trembling hands, Peters opened the folder. Inside were copies of documents he never imagined anyone would discover, financial records showing how he embezzled employee training funds, deleted emails where he coordinated the systematic elimination of older employees, evidence of discrimination and harassment against dozens of people over 5 years. Where did you get this? His voice was a terrified whisper. Jennifer Santos still has access to the old systems. She saved copies of everything before you broke her trust. I walked back to the front of the desk and stared him straight in the eye. Marcus Rodriguez kept detailed records of every abuse he suffered. And there are others. Many others. Peters began desperately leafing through the documents, his breathing quickening with each page. It was complete evidence of years of corporate criminal behavior. But wait, there's more, I continued, pulling another document from the folder. This is an official communication from Morrison & Associates headquarters in Chicago. They received a detailed anonymous report about irregularities at the Denver branch. A full audit will begin next Monday. The sound that came from Peter's throat was a primitive groan of despair. He finally understood that it wasn't just his position that was at stake, but his entire career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom. "Please," he whispered, all arrogance evaporating instantly. "Please, it doesn't have to come to this. We can work this out. I can give Michael a promotion, a raise." "Michael is in the hospital because of you," I replied coldly. "A stress-induced heart attack at 26. You nearly killed my brother with your sadism." Peters began to cry. Not crocodile tears or emotional manipulation, but genuine sobs of absolute terror. For years, he had used fear as a weapon against others. Now he was experiencing the terror of someone who finally faces the consequences of his actions. "I can change," he begged, falling to his knees beside the chair. "I can be different. I can treat everyone better. Please give me a chance. I have a family, kids in college." For several seconds, I watched the man who had systematically destroyed dozens of lives, now reduced to a frightened child begging for mercy. It was perfect poetic justice, the predator finally experiencing the vulnerability he had exploited in others. "Stand up, Peters." My voice took on the tone I used with broken prisoners of war. "You have two options. First, resign immediately, with a written confession of all the abuses documented in this folder, and disappear from the accounting industry forever." He stood up, wiping his nose with the sleeve of his expensive suit. "What's the second option?" "The audit proceeds as normal. The documents go to the legal department at Morrison & Associates, to the Colorado State Department of Labor, and to all major company review sites. Your career ends publicly, with a criminal investigation for harassment and embezzlement." Peters looked at the documents scattered across his desk, then at me, then back at the documents. The math was simple: confession and voluntary exile, or complete public destruction. "If I resign," he said in a broken voice, "will you guarantee that this stays between us?" "I guarantee that you will have the opportunity to rebuild your life away from here. But any attempt to return to the accounting industry or to harm any former employee of Morrison & Associates will result in the immediate release of everything." 30 minutes later, Peters had signed a detailed letter of resignation and a full confession of his abusive practices. He cleared his personal desk under my supervision, handed over all corporate passwords and accesses, and walked to the elevator carrying only a cardboard box with his personal belongings. At the elevator door, he turned one last time. "How did you know I wouldn't try to get revenge?" I smiled, the same cold smile I had perfected during military operations. "Because men like you are fundamentally cowards, Peters. You only attack those you perceive as weaker. And now you know exactly how strong I can be." The elevator doors closed, carrying Richard Peters out of Morrison & Associates forever. Jennifer Santos was promoted to regional manager that same afternoon. Marcus Rodriguez received an offer to return as a senior consultant. Lisa was officially recognized for her loyalty and integrity. And Michael? Michael was discharged from the hospital a week later, only to discover that he had been promoted to director of operations in Peters' absence. 3 months later, I met Michael at our childhood home in Denver, where he was making a full recovery. His color had returned, his weight was back, and for the first time in years, he was genuinely smiling. "Jacob," he said as we prepared the barbecue in the backyard, "how can I thank you for giving me my life back?" "You don't have to thank me, Mike. We are family. That's what family does." We watched the sun set over the Colorado mountains, two brothers who had faced a predator and won. The experience taught us that good people don't always have to accept abuse silently. Sometimes all they need is someone who refuses to be intimidated. 6 months later, Morrison & Associates Denver had become a model of a positive work environment. Productivity had increased 40%, employee turnover had dropped to virtually zero, and the company had won several awards for ethical management practices. As for Peters, I heard he found work as a junior accountant in a small town in Nebraska, far from any position of authority. Apparently, he learned humility the hard way. My military experience taught me that true victory is not in destroying the enemy, but in protecting the innocent and creating an environment where predators cannot thrive. Sometimes, showing strength is enough for justice to prevail. If this story of family courage and justice touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We have dozens of real stories about people who refused to be victims and turned impossible situations into inspiring victories. The last time I spoke with Michael, he was training new employees at Morrison & Associates, teaching them about dignity in the workplace and how to recognize signs of corporate abuse. He had turned his traumatic experience into a mission to protect others. And me? I went back to my normal life, but with one crystal-clear certainty: never underestimate what someone will do to protect their family. Especially when that person has spent 12 years learning exactly how to deal with predators. Peters thought he was breaking a gentle, submissive person. Instead, he awakened a protector who would not tolerate injustice. In the end, predation became protection, cruelty turned into compassion, and fear gave way to strength. That is the difference between those who build through destruction and those who rebuild through justice.